Buenas tardes, bienvenidas y bienvenidos a la cuarta conferencia del ciclo Metodologías de investigación en estudios de traducción e interpretación, organizado por el Grupo Traducción Literaria en el Uruguay, UDELAR, con el apoyo del Centro de Lenguas Extranjeras de la Facultad de Humanidades y Ciencias de la Educación y el posgrado en estudios de traducción de la Universidad Federal de Santa Catarina en Brasil. Este ciclo de charlas ofrece un panorama de diferentes metodologías de investigación en los estudios de traducción e interpretación. Es un espacio de intercambio en torno a diferentes perspectivas y decisiones metodológicas surgidas en la praxis, así como respecto de la interrelación de lo anterior con aparatos teóricos y posiciones discursivas y contextos de enunciación diversos. Interesa debatir los modos en que la metodología puede revelar nuevos aspectos del objeto y en qué medida ello se relaciona con la interdisciplinariedad de esta área. Orienta este ciclo la necesidad de explicitar los aspectos metodológicos que sostienen y guían nuestras investigaciones y los problemas a los que se enfrenta. Al mismo tiempo, pretende generar un espacio de intercambio entre investigadores provenientes de diferentes espacios y tradiciones académicas. También los invitamos a participar en el último evento del ciclo, que será el día jueves 25 de noviembre a las 19 horas, tiempo uruguayo, relevando representaciones a partir de entrevistas, el caso del español en la traducción editorial argentina contemporánea, que estará a cargo de Gabriela Villalba, del Instituto de Educación Superior en Lenguas Vivas, Argentina, y tendrá Gabriela la moderación del profesor Walter Carlos Costa de la Universidad Federal de Santa Catarina. La inscripción, como sabe, se realiza en el blog que aparece en la pantalla. Welcome to the fourth conference of the Ciclo Research Methodologies in Translation and Interpretation Studies organized by the Literary Translation Group in Uruguay. With the support of the Center for Foreign Languages of the Faculty of Humanities and Science Education of UDELAR, Uruguay, and the Postgraduate Studies in Translation Studies of Universidad Federal de Santa Catarina. This series of talks offers an overview of different research methodologies in translation and interpreting studies. It is a space for exchange around different perspectives and methodological decisions that have arisen in praxis, as well as with respect to the interrelation of the above with theoretical apparatuses and discursive positions and diverse enunciation contexts. It is interesting to discuss the ways in which the methodology can reveal new aspects of the object and to what extent this is related to the interdisciplinarity of this area. This cycle is guided by the need to make explicit methodological aspects that support and guide our research and the problems we face. At the same time, it aims to generate a space for exchange between researchers from different academic institutions and traditions. It is with great pleasure and with a lot of expectation about what we are going to learn today in the company of Anthony Pym, whose lecture on reflexive empiricism in translation studies is going to give way to great discussion, as we know well that he observes with critical eye, for example, Baker's and Venuti's consideration to empiricism. Anthony Pym, I'm going to give a very brief biography of Anthony Pym, has been a professional translator and translator trainer in Spain, the United States, and Australia for more than 20 years. He currently teaches at the University of Melbourne and is distinguished professor at the Rovira y Virgili University in Tarragona in Spain. He was president of the European Society for Translation Studies from 2010 to 2016. He has authored, co-authored, or edited 28 books and some 200 articles in the general field of translation and intercultural communication. And he holds a PhD in sociology from the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales de Paris. I would like to add also that Anthony Pym is somebody who has trained a lot of students with, he motivates students to research, and in Colombia we have had the possibility of having Colombian students under his guidance, for which we thank you very much. So we give you the microphone, dear Anthony.
Thank you very much, Marta. Muchas gracias también a Rosy for giving me the opportunity. I will speak in English, but questions can be in Spanish and Portuguese. Yes, one of my best students was from Colombia, David Orrego, doing very well. Okay, I'd like to talk today about research methodology, and my example will be from translation history, because a part of this project is concerning translation history in Latin America. My example, though, will come from Australia, which is where I am at the moment. Now, research, I remember the late and much regretted Gideon Toury commenting at one stage that he was not really interested in translation theory as getting right the way we do research on translation, and that if you set up the research methodology correctly, the theoretical concepts will come in. They will come in when they're needed in order to work on your problems. And I very much am in that line. With respect to methodology, we have this sort of mythical simplification of translation studies. In the bad old days, it was all prescriptive, telling translators what to do. And then suddenly there was this epiphany, and we became descriptive and went out into the world and started to describe what translators do. And we have found in the past 20, 30 years that translation is far more varied, far more complex than any of the prescriptive simplifications that preceded us. However, in that descriptive moment, very little attention has been paid to the problems that would inform neighboring disciplines. Any discipline that works fundamentally on alterity, on the fact that we are working with other languages and other cultures, and that we as researchers have a position within that. If you go through the early work in descriptive translation studies and in Gideon Toury, you'll find the presupposition that it is possible for the researcher not to be a player, indeed to be absent or neutral, and that your descriptions can be transparent to the thing described. Now, very few people in our neighboring disciplines would actually subscribe to that. And so that's what I want to deal with today, is the problematic nature of the researcher as a subject in the descriptive process. I just want to, before I go on, working on research methodology is absolutely important, I think, to know or conceptualize this as something that applies to the researcher, but also to the translator. Translators, when they are translating, they are engaging in the same kinds of problems of alterity as we are, and they are using concepts to solve problems. So I personally think that a focus on research can resolve some of the age-old problems we have around us, such as theory versus practice, academics versus professionals. What a lot of rubbish. It's research on both sides, and research in the overlaps. And most of the scholars, 94% of translation scholars, have translated regularly. Okay, that's research I did with Esther Torres. Do not believe in these big false oppositions. Now, my interest in this has come from a situation now where supervising a doctoral candidate, and my co-supervisor is an anthropologist, Adrian Hearn, here at the University of Melbourne, which is interesting. It's interdisciplinarity. And the students sort of complained at once to how I came into this topic not knowing what I was looking for, and I was wandering around, and I've collected all this stuff, and she's really worried about this, the feeling of being lost. And Adrian says, well, that's exactly how it should be. When I was trained as an anthropologist, this is what we learned to do, to forget yourself, to be immersed in the object, to get rid of your presuppositions, and go into the object with an open mind. And this gave some comfort to the student at that particular moment. And that intrigued me, because my own thinking on methodology is precisely the opposite. And I'll be talking here about anthropology and our relations with anthropology. Personally, I do train students to mess around for 1 year, basically. Yeah, get lost for a year and see what's interesting and what you really want to do. But at the end of that year, hey, I want a research question. I want some falsifiable hypotheses, if possible. I want to know what methodology you're going to use. And I want a timetable, a schedule, which is precisely the opposite of this immersion in the other. Why do I believe in those things? Well, because we have to train people to produce a product. Because one of the big problems I see is that our students, our research students, take on too much work. They initially have enough material for 2, 3, 4 doctoral theses, but also because there's a deeply held suspicion of the possibility of neutrality, which this undoing of the self seems to presuppose. I would make the same critique within translation theory of, for example, deverbalization, as if it's possible to get rid of language and get to pure message. No, I don't think you can do that. Or the neutrality of the researcher, which was presumed in Turi, for example. I don't think you can do that either. And that is why I will put my bets, or in my training with researchers, not to go down that road. I mean, do it for a while, because it's good to do it, to figure out where you are and what you want to do. But I would oppose that supposed neutrality or undoing of the self, which is also immersion in language education. It's also the concept of internationalization in localization. All these ideas that you can get rid of your own cultural baggage in order to do something entirely different. Firstly, I don't believe it's possible. I think you're kidding yourself when you do it. And secondly, it is wasteful, which for a poor Anglo-Saxon Protestant, is perhaps the greatest of sins, I must admit. Opposed to that, one can draw on the concepts of Gadamer's hermeneutics, for example, which recognizes that in order to construct knowledge in a process of engagement with the other, you need prejudice, Vorwurf. That you've got to have this passion and involvement in the object in order to keep yourself motivated. But then with that Vorwurf, prejudice, which is a positive thing in Gadamer, you have to reflect on it. And you have to make yourself aware of what you are doing and look at yourself from the outside. Okay, and this is what I'm talking about when I refer to reflexive. I think research should be empirical. That just means engage with data, and the engagement of data comes as primacy over the construct of theory. And then reflexive. It must help us to think about ourselves. Okay, so there are those two parts: empiricism, and for me that means falsifiable hypotheses, but I'm not working on that today, and self-reflection, which is what I am working on. Okay, now my story comes from Uh, some of the first engagements with the Arenta, which is the Aboriginal grouping in the very center of Australia. And we moved to about 1896 when Baldwin Spencer, who was a professor of biology at the University of Melbourne, who had been trained briefly for 3 months in anthropology in Oxford before coming out to Australia to be professor of biology. And he had been on several expeditions into the center of Australia, describing plants, animals, and aborigines, almost all on the same level. He worked with a mediator called Francis Gillen, who did know some of the language Arenta, although in his notes we see him using Pidgin English in order to gather knowledge from his informants. Now, my entry into this is actually a book published from 1907 in German, in Frankfurt, and it runs to 7 volumes, describing the legends, the myths, and the fairy stories of the Arenta, of these people. And that book was written by a missionary, a Lutheran missionary, a German called Karl Strelo. And in the first volume, Strelo says in a note at the bottom, when Spencer and Gillen say the word Alcheri means dream, the assertion is not correct. It's nicht zutreffend. To dream is Alcherama, derived from Algira, God, capital letter, and Rama, to see, thus to see God. We have a translation problem, ladies and gentlemen. We have apparently the same word being translated in 2 different ways. Spencer and Gillen have translated this Algira as to dream, and Gillen has proposed to talk about dreaming or the dream time. And this translation, which comes from these first accounts, is very widespread. You can find countless books on Aboriginal beliefs. I'm not talking about Torres Strait Islanders, it's Aboriginal here, referring to the dream time or the dreaming, the mythological time of the ancestors prior to the current period, what in German in this book is translated as the Urzeit, the primal time, okay? And many Aborigines now talking about their beliefs will themselves in English use the term dreaming. I was seeing the other night, knowledge of the land is knowledge of the dreamings in Aboriginal English. So this one anthropological account has had a very deep impact on the very words used to describe Aboriginal beliefs and the way Aborigines themselves talk about their beliefs in Australia. And the missionary is saying, no, you got it wrong. Algira doesn't refer back to the dreaming or anything. Algira is the word for God, okay? We have a translation conflict, and that's the conflict that I want to go into now. With my colleagues Andrea Rizzi and Birgit Lang here at the University of Melbourne, we have been working on trust-based translation history, a way of analyzing a short list of things to look for when you start doing translation history, and the very great interest of the question, who trusted who? If we are working between cultures and languages, one has to trust a guide or informant or a mediator about the unknown. Why? Because we don't know the other languages. That's why we have translators and mediators. So we ask very basic questions. Who trusted whom? And I'll move now to the network of trust around Baldwin Spencer. he has a building at this university named after himself, and he was actually head of the board of professors. He was the big man on campus. He was the campus back in the day. Okay. Now, Spencer trusts his informant Francis Gillen, who is of Irish descent, and he ran the telegraph station in Adelaide Springs, and he lived there for a long time. And Gillen is trusted by the Arenta informants, or at least he trusts them. Spencer assumes that Gillen is completely trusted by the informants, and he assumes that Gillen knows the language. Now, when Spencer goes from Melbourne to Alice Springs, he conducts his research as follows. Gillen gets the Aborigines, to the Arenta in this case, to perform their various ceremonies, and Spencer and Gillen are allowed to observe. Why are they allowed to observe? Because Spencer says they are regarded as fully initiated. And I was allowed to attend because I pretended to be Gillen's brother, a family relation, and we could get in there. Okay, so this initiated complete trust, ceremonies performed only by the men because they were initiated as men. They assumed, if you like, that anthropological immersion. Now, who trusts what they write? In the first case, Sir James Fraser, author of The Golden Bough and the big man in the English-speaking world about the study of folklore and mythology and the development of religion. Fraser was an evolutionist, and Spencer was trained in the evolutionist perspective, which means that, for example, higher religions, monotheistic, come from more primitive religions, which are totemistic, and that we can trace through that progression. So the discovery for Fraser of these very, very primitive people in the center of Australia was like a living museum, a window on the primitive mind of the thoughts and beliefs and family structures that preceded the higher levels. And so Fraser launched Spencer's and Gillen's books in the English-speaking world. He corrected the proofs, he arranged the publication. He had every interest in this knowledge supporting his own reputation as what was anthropology in that day. To some extent, we find Andrew Lang, a Scottish scholar of folklore, also drawing on Spencer's work and being in communication with Spencer. But then we find that Gillen and Spencer's translation of dreaming and their account of the Arenta is cited copiously, not just by Fraser, 1897, Marcel Mauss, 1900, Emil Durkheim, 1912, Malinowski, 1913, in his work on the family structure of the Australian Aborigines, and of course Sigmund Freud, Totem und Tabu, in 1913. So this account of the Arenta in the Central Australia had an enormous influence on the very founders of not just anthropology, but sociology and psychoanalysis, of course. Okay, so, and they all trusted that account. So that's the trust network around Spencer and the translation as dream time. Let me move now to the missionary Karl Strelov. Who trusts him? He trusts his informants, and he does speak their language. It's remarkable. Within 3 years, he was preaching in Arenta, and he had learned a different language before that, and he had people from another Loricha in the mission. So he was at least trilingual in the Aboriginal languages. His contact outside of Australia is Freiherr Baron von Leonhardi, who is an armchair anthropologist and is fascinated by Strelo's accounts of the Arenta beliefs. And Leonardi, like Fraser, on the other side, arranges the publication of Strelo's accounts. And in fact, the accounts are based on a question and answer process. Leonardi would ask Strelo, do they believe in reincarnation? What is the marriage ceremony like? How do family structures work? And those answers became the 7-volume account of the Aranda and Lorica people. Strelo is trusted by his family because he has one of his sons, the last born son, became an anthropologist, and his son also works in the field. So he has had a long line of family connections in Australia. And his work is very much admired, it must be said, by Marcel Mauss, who regards it as a great work of literature, a literary account of the beliefs. And he is cited by the same people that Spencer cites to some extent, although Malinowski, who cites Spencer a lot, will put a question mark when he cites Strelo. He's more suspicious because this is knowledge gathered through religion. Now, those two networks of trust cross paths. There's a letter at the end of 1901. Leonardi writes to Strelo, so the guy in Frankfurt in Germany, writes to Strelo, the missionary, asking him about God and beliefs in God. Strelo replies, December the 20th, 1901, stating that the Arenta believe in a high God who is called Algira. And that's the word we just saw there with God in brackets. Leonardi sees this as evidence that there is primitive religion and that the religion can have almost monotheistic beliefs. This is dynamite because that's one of the big debates. He sends that to Lang, who was a Scottish folklorist, who sends it to Spencer, who is the guy who had given the opposite account. Spencer goes off his little nut. He thinks this is complete rubbish, and he cites that letter from Strelo in German, which is a reminder that German was a very strong language of science in that period. He cites it in a letter to Sir James Fraser, who is his sponsor, saying, this is a load of rubbish. This is incorrect. This guy Strelo does not know what he's doing. So we have two trust networks with a point of radical distrust. Okay? Now, I want to analyze distrust. Sorry, I can go on for a long time with this story, but I'll try to go fast, okay? We've got, I remind you, the anthropologist who here does not trust the missionary, and the missionary does not trust the anthropologist. Why? Spencer says about Strelo, not just in this one letter, but in a whole stream of letters that goes for about 20 years. And you can tell he's been really hurt because somebody has questioned his methodology. He said, we didn't understand the language. And the big difference is Strelo knew the language and Spencer no idea of the language and had to trust his mediators. Now, Spencer says, Strelo, the missionary, has not attended the ceremonies. Spencer has. If he hasn't attended the ceremonies, he has to rely on spoken accounts, and the Aborigines, when spoken to, will tell you anything in order to get a good meal. That is, the knowledge was not free, and they will tell you whatever you think. He says also, because these ceremonies represent an anterior stage of knowledge, he's an evolutionist, they don't know the meaning of the chants anyway. So what they're telling you is only what they are told to tell you, and there is this other knowledge that they have forgotten and that the anthropologist can reconstruct. This is an evolutionary perspective. And then he tells you, you've only talked to men, and they will only tell you what the men tell the woman. So you're getting secondhand knowledge here. And then he says, they will tell you that Algeria is God because the missionaries who have that time been there for some 20 years have told them that the word Algeria means God prior to your arrival. And so to present this as evidence of their beliefs is only presenting evidence of the missionary incursion into their culture. Okay? And these are all really, really good arguments. And it's very hard for Strello to get around that. However, and for Leonardo, he sees all these arguments in these letters, and he writes to Strello and says, look, tell us your methodology, because this guy's attacking you. What is your methodology? And Strello doesn't. He's not really interested in the methodology. He's just giving the accounts. So von Leonardi, the German armchair anthropologist, in volume 3 of this 7-volume account, does give the methodology. And he launches a critique of Spencer and Gillen. What does he say? Firstly, Gillen pretends to know Arenta but doesn't, because we see he uses Pidgin English, and Strello has observed him using Pidgin English. 2, the ceremonies are staged for you, Mr. Spencer, who comes from Melbourne. Why? Because you tell us they happen at night, but here are your photographs and they're all in the daytime. 3, the ceremonies have to happen at certain sacred places, you tell us. But here we can see they all happen in Alice Springs, so you didn't have to travel to them. So what's happened is Gillen has paid the Arenta to give a little performance for the anthropologist coming up from Melbourne. 3, in your photos, and Spencer and Gillen, it's really wonderful work. There are numerous photos and diagrams, and both works are really, really quite wonderful accounts. You show the Aborigines naked in their primitive state, but the Aborigines around Alice Springs do wear clothes. So what you've done, you've made them take off their clothes in order to look more primitive in your accounts. 3 or 4, I don't know, 4. Your transcription of the Arenta sentences, the transcriptions are badly passed, and there are numerous language mistakes because you are not linguists. Then he says, the initiated men do understand the chants, and this is secret knowledge that can only be given under certain conditions. And then he says, Spencer and Gillen, if you think you have been initiated, you are wrong, because initiation into the Arenta implies subcision of the penis. So I'm not going to show you photos of that. Go and look it up in Wikipedia. I assure you that the big professor from Melbourne had not undergone the initiation ceremony of the Arenta. Or if he did, he was a very brave man. Okay. I'd like to look at some of the photos now. Oh, you've got the photos up there. Oh, good. Okay. This is where we get into it. So you can see here some of the photos from Spencer and Gillen, 1896. Oh, yes, we have naked breasts, which, sets all the anthropologists alight at the stage. And it's true that there's a lot of nakedness in it, although the men are tactfully covered in the vital parts. Let's move on to the next slide, please. And now this is the first page of Strello's account. And you can see on the right, the first page, and what he's got, he's put a photo of his main informants. What can we see? They are 4 men, they are clothed, and they are respectably old. Next slide, please. Here they are. The kneeling posture is worrying. It looks, if it were in the United States, you'd expect them to be wearing shackles, perhaps. It does imply some kind of Christian reverence. Now, we do know who these people were, and we do know approximately their dates of birth. So especially the man on the far left was a clever man, a man of great knowledge, who had been born well before the Lutheran missionary came there. So he and the one next to them would be giving accounts that were prior to Christian indoctrination. And this is put at the beginning of the volume as a reply to the kinds of critiques coming from Spencer, saying, look, these are our informants. They are old. And the other two did work on the mission, so their accounts might be more suspect because there was monetary exchange. I could talk more about them, but I want to get on to other issues. So let's move forward. Now, this is the account that, I'll get it bigger so I can see it over here, right? This is the account that Strelo gives of the god Algira. And you can see he's up in the sky, big, strong man, hair falling over his shoulders, emu feet. And in another place, he says, others say that Algira himself has emu feet and he's in the sky, which is Alkira. Now, what's important here in this account is eternal, which is repeated twice, and the present tense. So in this book, when Strelo describes the beliefs, he says they are living beliefs in the present tense, and there is a conception of the eternal, the infinite, which was one point of debate. And this is the big difference for me. In my published work on this, I go through the grammar of the German, and I argue that it's actually the use of the present tense is the big difference between the two. Spencer, the anthropologist, did everything he could to make these people look primitive. And he insists they are primitive. He insists that they are going to die out. So when he goes back in the 1920s and he finds that his original informants have all died out, he's not surprised at all. It's sort of, I told you so. Whereas Strelo is observing something that he believes is alive and well and vital and a part of the worldview. Let's move on to the next slide, please. Oh, sorry, I'll go over here. Okay, now what's interesting is, and this is just well known for people who work with First Nations knowledge in Australia. For us, when we look up at the heavens at night, we join up the dots and see animals and things in the shapes, right? The indigenous view of the sky is of the dark spots which join up, okay, seeing the same thing. So here's the Milky Way, and you can just see the emu that is up there, okay? And the emu feet, which are at the end of it. And for the beliefs here, the stars are either the hair coming over or the many campfires that Algira has as he moves around in the sky. Okay, so there's a different way of looking at the sky. Move on, please. Now, following that account of the way it's working, Strelo tries to analyze this linguistically because he's been trained as a linguist, and German anthropology from von Humboldt from the beginning believed that language was the key to understanding the other culture. So he tries here in this account, the published one, 1907, he says etymology, it works for European languages, which were being connected at that stage. It doesn't work, it won't work in Australia because of the huge time distances involved. He then does a confidential analysis and he finds in Algira, in this account, certain features that are shared with the Christian God, okay? And then he gives the result of a question and answer process. They say Algira is one who has not been made, therefore the eternal. And as I mentioned, he works on it in the present tense. Let's move forward, please. Now, okay, there's the problem. We've got one word, we've got two translations, we've got two trust networks, and we've got distrust between them. Whose side am I on? I'm telling you this story. And it's got many, many features to it, but I'll just focus on this. Whose side am I on? And why should you believe me? Like, who are you going to trust? Do you trust the anthropologist or do you trust the missionary? Hey, I'm born in this country. I'm brought up, actually, my father's family is from a Lutheran part of South Australia. Okay, I have a religious schooling, middle class Australia. I do read and enjoy German. I came across this when I was working on a recently, well, it's just coming out this month, a book on translation studies in Australia and New Zealand. I have a chapter there. And in that chapter, I go back and I try to show the role of translators and of extreme multilingualism in Australian history. And that's how I came on Strelo's account of Algira. Okay, so I have an interest in Strelo. And the other guy, Spencer, he's English, he's Oxford trained, he's arrogant, he insults Strelo, he doesn't come out with a published critique of Strelo, he works by writing little letters to everybody all over the place. So whose side am I on? Oh, you guessed it, I'm for the missionary. And other people are for the missionary as well. There is a missionary team in this debate, which extends through history, because Strelo's son, Theodore, wrote in his defense, wrote remarkably over the many years in his defense. He was brought up in Arenta and German. Okay, so he was brought up bilingual, which is an interesting position for an anthropologist. And his grandson, as you'll see very soon. Okay, so I'm very definitely on one side. Let's move forward, please. But let me show you some of the evidence now, as I do this research. This is the letter I talked about, where Spencer goes off his little nut writing to Fraser, complaining about this idea that Algira is God. And this is the citation in German, which he has there, which is, Fraser responds, everybody cites German in German. Now, it's hard to read that. So when I go through the archives in the museum here, or actually it's online, next slide, please. Can we move to next? I find a typewritten English translation of the same letter. Wonderful. Oh, let's look at this. And of course, from the letter, it extracts just the little bits that Spencer was interested in having known. And Spencer has had this typed up and put in his archives. Who for? Well, for me, to make it easy for me to find the evidence that Spencer wants me to find. I say this somewhere in my book on translation history. Information doesn't just sit there. Information has been put there or maintained there in the interest of somebody getting you to see that information. We don't just find it like leaves lying on the ground or something like that. People have put it there, and you've got to ask why. And Spencer put it there so I would not believe Strelo. Next one, please. So that's suspicious in itself, okay? And he does the same thing for a letter from Kemper, who's one of the previous missionaries who had decided to use Algira as the name for the Christian God. And Kemper says in this lovely typewritten translated excerpt, we know it wasn't good, it was a bad fit, but we had no alternative but to use this. Okay, and the Lutherans at that stage did tend to use the First Nations terms. Presbyterians, however, had the opposite strategy. They would use the English terms and impose that on the other languages. Next slide, please. Good. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. This came out last month in the Australian by Strelo's grandson, John Strelo, going back through this evidence and announcing that Walter Spencer not only typed up these letters so that the historian would find it, but also forged letters. Let's move forward and look at the forgery, please. So this is a letter from Kemper That was the previous missionary who had made the decision effectively to use Algira as God. And Strello's son, grandson, John Strello, compares the handwriting. Next slide, please. And if you look at the handwriting here, you can see they're talking about Algira. Just compare the A's, and you will see that it's similar handwriting, but a graphologist would tell you it's not the same handwriting. So the accusation is being made as I speak that the professor at the University of Melbourne not only translated and typed up evidence, but also perhaps forged letters to build up his position. Let's move forward, please. Now, as I work on this, though, several things have happened. First, going through Spencer and Gillen, which is thousands of words and numerous photos, I'm beginning to see that they were very serious scholars. They had what seems to me an erroneous preconception about what they were studying, and they always tried to insist on the primitive nature and get this quickly because it's going to disappear. These people are dying out, but their accounts are invaluable. And I look at Strello and I do see, for example, in the letter that is cited and in the publication, one in 1903, one in 1907, he changes his account. He makes a strong account of a high god in the letter, does not make that same account in the published version. He was taking Arenta cultural objects and sending them to von Leonhardi in Frankfurt, and von Leonhardi was selling those to museums all over Europe. And with the money from that, Strello built his family a house in Germany, fixed up the mission church as well, and paid for trips for his family. Most of his family did actually go back to Germany. He died in Central, it's not far from his mission station there, actually in Australia. Strello permanently altered the languages he was describing, so which is inevitable, I think, because of the missionary position. So the current word for Algira in Western Arenta now does mean the Christian God, and the word for the guy in the sky has been taken from Loricha, from the neighboring language. So there's not a neutral description at all. It's a very incursive description. And it's suspicious that his greatest defenders are his family and by Germanists. Outside of that network, many people do pay homage to the quite wonderful work done by Spencer and Gillen. So my trust in Strello has been going down, and my admiration for Spencer, paradoxically, has been going up. He was hurt. He tried to defend his reputation on the European stage, but at the same time, he did some serious work. Can we move forward, please? So where am I now? Among the papers and the debates, there are people who say, look, you're arguing about nothing here. And it's true that in Spencer's earlier work, 1896, you do find an account of exactly the same high god almost the same high god with the emu feet and all that Strello describes with a different name. But that's not surprising because you're in different parts of Central Australia. So one could reconstruct, put the two together, triangulation, as we say. We could use that in order to arrive at something that might be near a kind of truth in the object. And that's what von Leonhardi says in his critique. He says, look, you can use one who has the language and the other who doesn't have the language but has the ceremonies, and put them together. He doesn't use triangulation, but he uses a comparative method and says, why not? But then he gives all the reasons why we should not trust Spencer. Let's move forward, please. A different position can be found in the literature. I have to finish quickly here. And it's found, this is Malinowski, citing 1913, and he says that the problem with this debate is that people think it's one or the other, and he phrases it negatively. It's very negatively. The Aborigines are not able to think exactly, and their beliefs do not possess any exact meaning. It's very negative as deficit, but it could also mean that there's tremendous variation and localization of language and beliefs. But this is how Malinowski does attempt to maintain an open mind on what he is discovering. Next, please. You can look at that in positive terms, the same thing in positive terms. And this is where we get to hardcore methodology. Take just an example of Derrida reading Kant, and this one of these painfully exacting analyses of the passages. We have the one word that could be translated in three different ways. And Derrida says, well, do we know which one is correct? And accepts that we will never know which one is correct. You could find this in Quine as well, on the Gavagai example, on the first contact with the unknown culture, that we will never reduce the indeterminacy of translation. And so we have Derrida's, in this commentary on Kant, l'équivoque demeure. Equivocation, it doesn't mean equivocación in Spanish. It means equivocation is not resolving the problem, is maintaining all the possibilities in the air. Il n'est pas exclu que les deux occurrences. It's not excluded that the two renditions had more or less the same meaning for Kant. That one can use this methodology of equivocation to maintain doubt without reducing it to one reading or the other. Next slide, please. This term, equivocation, is picked up by some anthropologists working in Brazil, and we have this quite well-known paper on perspectival anthropology, controlled equivocation, inspired by Derrida. And this is of interest to me because it sort of describes where I am at the moment. I am forced to accept that both sides of this debate have good and bad points. Both can be trusted to some degree, but only to a degree. And that my work here as a mediator is to recognize equivocation and to transfer that to you if you trust me. Next slide, please. Why is this important? The real importance is that in Australia, in the past 20 years or more, if you can see the dates there, we've been going through a process of native title. And in this process, by which communities have to prove their long-standing attachment to land or country, as one says, they have to show records. And oral culture does not have records that have dates. So the use of Strelo is touted by Anna Kenny, who has been an anthropologist, giving submissions to these hearings in order to get native title around the lands in the center of Australia there for the Arrenta. It's not said by Anna Kenny, who is in Strelo's camp, that the work of Spencer and Gillen is also cited in these submissions in order to gain native title. If you're looking at the map, you'll just see that the laws are very different in each state. So in Western Australia, has considered a lot of desert in the center, which is not the case in Northern Territory. And the place around Alice Springs is actually in the Northern Territory there. So why is this important? It's important, I think, not just to lament the European invasion. It's necessary to lament it, but not to stop at that and not to just say, well, both of these were equally bad because they changed the object of study. Let's be more practical in the real world, guard the equivocation that is there, respect it, convey it, but also have some thanks for the work of these people who invested their labors in knowledge of another culture, and that very belatedly have been able to restore some attachment to land, to that culture. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anthony. I'm going to put my. Okay. So you're giving us a very different perspective on translation research, no, and on how the translator can, or the researcher can put himself into a position to find new ways, no, to think the translation. I always think that translation is a path, no, is a way. You're never there. You're never at the end of the road, as we have always put it, no, translation from one place into the other, from one language into the other, from one culture into the other. But I don't know, regarding America, for example, I have always thought that we are the product of mistranslation. America, no, we are the product of mistranslation. But in a way, what you're saying, missionaries did what they could, no, they had to produce some representation of the people they find, or they found. So
I should add, Martha, the work of Strello, the 7-volume, is a magnificent literary artifact, but it's run there, I think, with Bernardino de Sahagún, with his work on the Nahuatl beliefs, who was writing in the 2 languages with the images of the Quarantine Codex. So there are points in common with Latin American history.
Yeah, and also when you say Gillen and Spencer didn't know the language, no, but they saw the people, no, they saw the ceremonies.
Spencer knew some. He lived there for some 27 years, so he knew something.
Okay.
But he's reported as, and his notes are written in Pidgin English. When he's citing an informant, it's in Pidgin English.
Yeah. Okay. But for example, in America, when the missionaries arrived in Brazil, for example, I say, but they just arrived, they didn't know the language, and they started writing the chronicles and about what they saw, what they imagined, they understood, but the language, I think, took time to arrive. And there is this story also from one missionary that 20 years after, writes his book to prove that what the other missionary was saying 20 years ago was not right. No, I think it was Léris and Evreux, the 2 missionaries that were in America. So I think there are many things to learn through translation with this kind of empiricist research that you are proposing, Anthony. No?
Yes. Are there any questions? People can write in the chat, I think.
Yeah, I'm going to tell people that they could write the questions in Spanish also, or in Portuguese, and Anthony is able to understand. Nayeli is saying que dicen los antropólogos actuales que no son familiares de Strello, de
bueno, hay dos campos opuestos. Es la realidad. You saw this in The Grandson accusing of forgery. It's a very strong accusation as well, in the newspaper. And you can see who's on which side. The people around the Arenta, there's a Strello research center on the site of the mission, and people go there and work on it. The prestige of Strello is enormous around that area.
Mhm.
People, there's a dictionary. I mean, he described the language and he uses the writing in such a way that one can learn the language. So in my written account, I actually associate his written methodology with the language learning books used in 19th century Germany. So you can pick up the language, and then he does have a dictionary, a huge dictionary which he written by hand, which is now being edited, and the Arenta people go over, and what they see is the language that people were speaking at the end of the 19th century, which is very different from what they're doing now. But it's
Mhm.
giving them a record of their culture with some historical depth.
Mhm.
So the anthropologists, they're still in two teams, I think.
Mhm. Okay. But in any case, so what would be the meaning of Algira for you?
Oh, well, it's very clear that currently in Western Arenta, it means the Christian God, because they have
Mhm.
adopted a word for the guy in the sky from Lorica.
Mhm.
Do I know, or do the veracity of what Strello wrote in that letter, the one that really upset Spencer? I think I think Strello was overstating the case because he then
Mhm.
retracted.
Uh-huh.
And I
Okay.
think that Spencer was overstating the case because he himself had described the same belief, albeit with a different name. So it was really a very irrational, a very emotional, a very passionate um, conflict between two very powerful men who never met, which is interesting as well. They could have easily, but never did. Uh, it's yeah, it's what do you call it? Yeah, arrogance, academic arrogance on both sides. This is what we're dealing with here.
Okay. Okay. There is a commentary here by Karina Villalba. Extraordinary example of the danger of the invisibility of translators in the writing of our past and present. And they thank you.
I think if I could
Tenemos.
comment on that, I'm more and more wary of translation history that's based on numbers of books, for example,
Ujú,
or translation flows, as if each element in a flow that we're counting had the same value. I really think we have to get much closer to the people involved and the interactions between all the agents involved in a translation process to see it as a much richer interhuman problematic.
ujú. And maybe what you are proposing, the best methodology or the most apt uh, methodology for researching on these kind of languages that are not Western languages is empiricism, isn't it?
I think for any, I think, I mean, what we're doing is okay. The danger is to adopt those kinds of things we find in training books for translators. There are two methods of translation. There's domestication or foreignization, and here are your examples. Or Vine Dabune. You've got seven categories, and here are your examples. And a lot of our work is done, top down, arranging all the data to fit into our preconceived categories. So when I'm talking about empiricism, I really mean the bottom up. You have your categories, you get the data to challenge the categories, to change the structures that we had when we came into the object. It's not entirely bottom up. I don't believe we produce and communicable knowledge just by getting lost in data. I think you need the dialectic process of both. But I'm very, very suspicious of people imposing their categories on data and leaving it at that.
Mhm. Okay, there is a question by Rosie. Rosie is saying, ¿qué perspectivas surgen de la articulación de Translation Studies e Indigenous Studies en la academia australiana? ¿Cuáles
Yeah,
serían los mayores desafíos?
that's really interesting because where I am, my colleagues are working on Aboriginal languages, Indigenous languages, and helping to revive them. So that means producing educational materials so kids can learn the language that their parents and grandparents were made to forget. And that is restoring cultural identity to these communities. And I think that is a tremendous, as I said in another talk, it's the most noble linguistic challenge that we face. So I have nothing but admiration for my colleagues who are doing that. Unfortunately, translation is not on their agenda. It is involved in the production of learning materials, which are bilingual. But the role of translation in that is sort of invisible. Why? Because the dominant language learning methodologies based on immersion think they got rid of translation and relegated it to the 19th century. Without being aware that it's there, and mental translation is in language education anyway. So that's one thing. The other thing that's interesting for me is the question of how translation operated between indigenous communities prior to the invasion. And if I go through the accounts, we have numerous linguistic accounts of language movements, language shifts, of multilingualism, because communities would generally have people growing up in 3 languages. So and the idea I have is that these communities did not need much translation because of multilingualism. So translation is not on the agenda of researchers working there. Okay. And it's even more intriguing because when it does appear, I said this at a meeting, and one of my colleagues, Ruth Singer, said, yes, we do have translators for prohibited relations. Like a man cannot speak directly with his mother-in-law. It's a very intelligent culture, this one. And so you would either have a conversation where they're facing the other way, back to back, right? Or you go through mediation, which may be a translation.
Okay.
So there's a whole area waiting to be discovered there about the extent to which translation existed in pre-invasion relations.
Okay, maybe it's the same in the Americas, no? It's a common point because our people here also were multilingual, no? They spoke the language of the people around them. So in that case, they wouldn't need translation either. There is a question by Lucía. ¿De qué manera su análisis se puede relacionar con la teoría postcolonial en los estudios de traducción?
I have to be more precise. It's all post-colonial because obviously we're talking about post-invasion and people working on that. As far as I know, if you've got post-colonial theories, a lot of it is pointing out the role of translation in the repression of indigenous cultures, or in the colonial domination of Indian law in Niranjana's work, for example. Sure, yeah, but I'm not interested in the theory. I want to find out what happened, and more than that, what should happen. If I'm working on multilingualism and the role of translation in Australian history, it's because I'm also working on its role in an extremely multilingual society now. And I want to try to bring out that what we're doing now, Melbourne has some 250 languages spoken at home. The kind of work we're doing now does have a relation with the enormous multilingualism which was back there in the early days of contact. So I don't want the theory, I want discovery. I want discovery procedures. Let us help solve problems rather than lament the past, or only lament the past.
Okay. Do you think, Anthony, that as I think we as translators, in a way we behave as anthropologists, as you said, no? We try to really understand the other. But I was talking to a researcher in Romi studies in Colombia, the Gypsy studies in is very recent, is quite recent, and I asked them, so where is the literature? I want to know. There is literature written in other countries, but in Colombia, where is the literature? I want to read their literature, because what is written is what is going to stay, no? And I say that from my perspective, and he answered me, they have their history in their bodies, in their movements, in their music, in their handcraft. So I said, of course, we are always talking about ourselves. We're not talking about the other, no?
Yeah,
So,
sure. The other thing is here, I had to move into reconstruction of oral exchanges from written accounts. And that's part of the problem. That's why you've got to be suspicious of the written accounts that are there. I was at a conference, the other week. I was at a conference in Ottawa, online, of course, on Roma studies around Debbie Folleron and translation and the role in that. And very, very similar comments to the one you brought out, but also regret, because at least the written provides evidence for history and for depth and gives stability to an identity. So I hesitate to just celebrate the non-written. I think we do privilege the written, but it does have its virtues, as you can see in the land, the native title claims in Australia. I by no means regret the imposition of the written word.
Okay, yeah. I'm going to read this comment by Ana D'Amore. There are a number of analogies that can be drawn between translation equivocations perpetrated by missionaries in various continents, some of which are only just coming to light centuries later. It will be interesting to see what we can learn from all of these.
Sure. A lot of my thinking here was based on work I did on the missionaries in what is now Mexico. And David Moore, in his work on this exact same problem, also draws on that. Missionaries confronted the same problems, no matter what they're calling, and they also confronted problems to which there is no solution. You know, if you impose the word God, you're not sure that the other is understanding what you mean by God. You will never be sure. But if you take one of their words and use it as God, one of the accounts I have in Mexico is they took the native word chi and used it for God, and praised that name, and then spat on all the other names. They would pronounce the other names and spit on them to indicate that these were lesser gods. Okay, so they had to take one of the locals and promote that to monotheistic status. If you do that, you'll never be sure that the other is not worshipping their anterior gods, because the name continues. So there is no good solution to this problem. That's why it's interesting.
I'm going to read the question of Juan Guillermo Ramirez, my colleague at the Universidad de Antioquia. Now that you mentioned the agents, is there a way of finding a voice for those who are not directly heard, in this case, the natives? Do we still need the mediation of these agents originating in the West, including historians? Methodologically, what sources could we turn to, or what other sources could we turn to?
Yeah, there's a whole interesting area of translation history, which involves what I just mentioned in reconstructing oral encounters on the basis of written records. There's a wonderful paper on torture procedures in, I think, 17th century France, 17th century France, when you got the record, and from the record you can see what languages, or infer what languages were used in the torture process. Kayoka Takeda, working on interpreters being accused of war crimes, is doing much the same work, going from the written record and going back to try to figure out what was happening in the oral encounters. It's very difficult, but very necessary, I think, in order to go beyond the written word. And it's forensic. It's forensic work, it's detective work. So some of my articles in recent years I have written as detective accounts. Yeah, exploring, discovering things, not getting to a definitive solution, but I just write up the account of the investigation that I've made. I'm very happy with the translation history as a detective novel. I think it's great, but you never find out who the murderer is at the end. You never
Mhm,
get to the punchline. Okay.
mhm. Yeah,
I
okay.
did want to mention here, the photo I showed of the 4 informants there, Strello's informants, who are clothed, of course, a publication out of people at the Strello Research Center goes through each one, and people have recognized them as their descendants, and from their oral tradition have given us names and accounts of each one and what they were doing and why they would have volunteered the information. Now, for the one on the far left, who was the clever man, witch doctor, some would say, but the one with the most knowledge, it seems that he and Strello had a mutual respect for each other, as knowledgeable men might from different cultures. But that the knowledge was given on the implicit understanding that they could then perform the ceremonies on their tribal, on their land. And Strello reneged on that. He said, "Thank you very much for all this knowledge. Now you cannot perform your ceremonies here because this is a Christian place." And Strello never attended ceremonies, never wanted to compromise his Christian status as the other.
Mhm,
Upon which Lorica, the other man, left the place, never came back until after Strello's death. Came back after his death and asked to be baptized, we are told. Why? So that he could be buried on his land, simply for that reason. Um, yeah, we can, through oral history, reconstruct quite a lot of what was going on there. If you have the time to sit down with people and listen to their stories.
mhm. Yeah, it doesn't come out as a kind of a speculation?
You mistrust everybody, of course. Of course. Everybody could be lying, okay? It's like this detective work. But if there's 3 accounts agree and it seems vraisemblable, it seems like it would fit the case, you run with that. So I have no reason to distrust the work done. This is work organized by Anna Kenny, an anthropologist working at or around the Strello Research Center. I think that's done in good faith.
Okay, I don't know if Juan Guillermo feels that the question of the agent was resolved or at least discussed.
Oh, well, yeah, I mean, that's the problem. Spoken language disappears from history.
Mhm.
It's hard work to get back to it,
Yeah,
but
yes.
worth it, worth the trip.
Okay, okay. So what do you think is what perspectives are in general, as a general question, in translation studies, do you think? And translation history, and then I'll read the comment that is on the chat.
Uh,
Because you bring, I think you're bringing us something new, no? I am very happy to listen to you and to see this new perspective, because we sometimes in the theory and history of translation we are always repeating what others say, but you're looking for new ways, no, to go on with translation history.
to tell you the truth, Martha, don't tell anybody, okay? Um, I don't really care that much about translation history.
Uh-huh.
Uh, I mean, here I'm working on a problem of what it means to be white in Australia and the
Mhm.
guilt, the tremendous guilt associated with that. And if I do this research, it's to work on that problem. And if it takes me into anthropology or sociology or psychoanalysis or anything, that's good. And some of that will be translation. But I'm at a stage of my academic career where I have no reason to just do translation and not anything else.
Mhm.
Or pick up these texts and just look at the translational aspects. Here I've picked up a translation problem because, hey, that's the only thing people will listen to me about. But the work on it has to go beyond that into all the other relations that were involved. Why not?
Mhm.
So I'm beyond I have no real interest in presenting a ready-made and closed discipline. I don't think that is the way forward for me personally. It may be for somebody else.
I'll comment on that after I read this comment. From Rosie, Rosie says, this reminds me of Gerald Murnam's short story, Land Deal, which could be a good start for the novel.
Which
don't-
is a
I don't
novel
feel
that I'm going to write about Shallow and Spencer. That would make a good
Okay, but you know what you're just saying, I think probably this was what was missing in translation, to have a real problem of our real life, and to use translation or even our methodologies to understand a certain problem that is not necessarily translation. No, I think it has more sense, the research. No.
Look, when students come and they want to do a doctorate or postgrad research, and they say, what can I work on? And I know if I give them the answer, it's not going to be right because it has to come from them. So I'll ask them, why are you here? Why have you come to me? Why are you thinking about translation? Or what is your inner motivation? And unless you can tap into that and realize what it is, that student won't have enough passion to produce good research and to get to a finished thesis or publication or whatever. So I don't think it's just me. I think it's also a good methodology to recognize that you need that inner passion, whatever it may be, and to ask yourself about it as a very, very deep, ongoing form of self-reflection.
Okay, I think your talk also leaves a reflection on what we do as academic, no, as professors. Do we do a work that is meaningful? Or no?
I have doubts about that too. Don't worry.
Okay. I don't know. I think, Anthony, it's such an interesting talk, and it leaves us with a lot of doubts also, no? A lot to think. And I don't want to take your time any longer. You are you are in Australia, and we have people in Uruguay who's it's a little later than in Colombia, because I see there are some Colombians in your conference, in your talk. So I would like to thank you so much for this. I think it's very illuminating talk. No, I think it leaves us with a lot to think about. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Martha, and great thanks to the questions, people who asked the questions. It's great to interact with you.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much to people who were here with us, and to the organizers, Rosario and Leticia, the organizers of this research seminar. Thank you very much.
Adios.
Anthony, I think Rosie's saying, I think Rosie's saying to stay a little bit. I think we are not in YouTube anymore, no?
It says live on 27. Okay.
Okay. Yeah, I think so.
Me quedo aquí o me voy?
I think we stay a little bit.
Okay.
Rosario said. Thank you very much, Anthony.
Okay. Finish, yes, finish, Rosario.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see. I don't know if Rosie's waiting for us. Yeah. Okay. So no, I think we're going to finish. Anthony, I'm going to let you free for the